Alright folks, hope y'all are enjoying the weather. Let's start talking about Chapter 4. So a little overview here of tissues, types of tissues. The major tissue types are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue, and I'll go over some general properties of each of those. Epithelial tissues, you tend to find these on, maybe an easy way to think about it is surfaces, although when you start to think internally, maybe it's a little harder to understand what surfaces. But epithelial tissues, a lot of times you'll find them on things that have a free surface, like your skin, right? And I'm going to sneeze. Whew. Anyway, you'll find them on free surfaces. That's easy to see on your skin, right? So I have a free surface on my skin that's exposed to the environment. But when you start to think internally, right? So in your digestive system, you have a free surface, right? So the surface that interacts with the food that you eat, right? Or the liquids that you drink, those are all free surfaces. They are, in essence, exposed to the environment. The free surfaces that you have on or in your lungs, for instance, right? So there's a sense of apical or there's a sense of a exposed surface and a basal surface. And so anytime you find that, you're going to find epithelial tissues. With one exception, and that exception is glandular tissue. So let me change my screens here right quick and show you this. So the thing about glandular tissue, so if you think about maybe endocrine or exocrine glands, the way they all start is just kind of as a free membrane like this, where you would have an upper and a lower surface. But as you develop, what will happen is in that tissue, you'll get a little indentation that forms. Right? And that'll carry on until maybe you get something that looks like this. Right? And then what can happen is either this duct will remain or maybe that duct goes away and you'll end up with just a gland that sits there like that. If the duct remains, then that's called an exocrine gland. If the duct goes away, then that's simply an endocrine gland. The important thing here is that both of these, though, are made up of epithelial tissues. They're just a little different because they're embedded deep, but they all started as this membrane or as this tissue that did have a free surface exposed to it. And so that's one of the kind of differences or one of the issues that sometimes throws students a little bit if I ask you what type of tissue are glands made of, right? Epithelial tissues. But they all have an apical surface and they all have a basement membrane. How they're classified is based on two things. One, are they single layer thick or multiple layers thick? If they're single layers thick, then they're called simple. If they are multiple layers thick, then they're called stratified. And so when you're naming epithelial tissues, that's one of those two, right? Either simple or stratified is the name you'll pick. And then you'll pick the second name based on its shape. So are they kind of scale-like structures, in which case we call them squamous. So simple squamous tissue are single layers of kind of scale-like looking cells. Stratified squamous, multiple layers. And the other thing you have to look at when you're naming tissues is typically you want to look at this upper surface. Notice how these at the bottom look kind of cube-shaped, but as you move up, they become more flattened out. And so that's the one to pay the most attention to, is what it looks like up here, and a little less what it looks like down at the basement. Right, so a single layer of cube-shaped cells, simple cuboidal. Multiple layers, simple or stratified cuboidal. And then you get the columnar, so simple columnar, stratified columnar. This pseudostratified is a little different. It's called pseudostratified because the way the cells end up kind of being squished where you typically find this tissue. And because it's squished, it kind of moves the nuclei around a little bit so that when you look at it under a microscope, it looks stratified, even though it isn't. So pseudo means false, and stratified means multiple layers. So if this one is pseudostratified, it's falsely stratified, which means it's one cell layer thick. Usually an easy way, and I don't like what they've shown you here, but usually an easy way to tell if you're looking at pseudostratified epithelial tissue is you will tend to find cilia on the top, because a lot of times these are in the respiratory system. Anywhere that you secrete a decent amount of mucus, you'll find oftentimes pseudostratified epithelial cells, because they have a cell type in there called goblet cells that secrete that mucus, right? So your book talks about these, so simple cuboidal, simple columnar, pseudostratified, so on and so forth, right? And then another way that might help you remember where these are or their names is to kind of look at some of their locations and look at some of their functions. Sometimes tying those two together may help, right? So you might see a picture, so maybe I give you a picture like this and I ask you to identify it. I also would ask you generally where you typically find some of these tissue types. Now, I'm not going to go into any huge detail, so I'm not going to necessarily say where would you find stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue, what particular organ. Although I might ask you where would you typically find some epithelial tissues in general. Ones I would focus on a lot, ones that I just talked about, so where would you find maybe simple squamous epithelial tissue? Or just some characteristics of them, right? So characteristics of epithelial tissue in general, right? I talked about the pseudostratified epithelial tissue. The other one that's kind of special is this transitional epithelial tissue. Notice if you look at the top, it kind of looks like it's cuboidal, but then these shapes underneath are just all over the place. The reason it's transitional, you typically find transitional epithelial tissues in organs that tend to distend and need to. So think about your bladder. Your bladder fills up with urine. Usually about 200 milliliters is how much it fills up with before you get that first urge to go to the bathroom. Obviously, if you don't go, right, you can hold it, right? If your bladder wasn't made of transitional epithelial tissue, which could the cells could slide past each other and get larger. If it couldn't do that, then you wouldn't be able to hold it, right? So either your bladder would rupture or you would just create so much pressure there you couldn't hold it anymore. Obviously you can, and that's because these transitional cells can move past one another, slide past one another, and distend, and allows that stretching and expansion, right? So then your book talks about endocrine and exocrine glands, and then here's, again, their drawings aren't nearly as good as mine, but you can get an idea for these ducts. But yeah, lots of functions. Ducts function to secrete things. So endocrine glands secrete things that's essentially taken up by the bloodstream. Exocrine glands, think about sweat glands, right? So they secrete things that pass through a duct onto a surface. You have them in your stomach too that may secrete acids or whatever, right? So endocrine and exocrine glands. Right? Then we move on to connective tissue. Connective tissue is all over the map. So they talk about connective tissue proper, which is just in general connective tissue, dense connective tissue, just all over the place. So connective tissue can be anything from things like areolar tissues, which are just kind of diverse. You can't pick out any one specific cell type when you look at areolar tissues. And so this would kind of be somewhat of an example of that. Adipose tissue, that's fat. Right, so all of your fat tissue is adipose tissue, which is a connective tissue. Blood, in and of itself, is a connective tissue, right? So remember, to define a tissue, it's just multiple cells kind of working together to perform a similar function. That's blood. Blood has a large cellular component to it, but it also has a large acellular component to it, which is all the liquid that's in there. So blood, in and of itself, right, not red blood cells specifically, but whole blood is considered a connective tissue. Your bones are connective tissue. The cartilage is connective tissue, right? Irregular or regular elastic connective tissue, we consider it dense because of the way it looks under a microscope. So those are all connective tissues. Some important things about connective tissues is they tend to have, not always, but they tend to have a extracellular matrix to them. So they have a part that exists kind of outside. Let's see if I can find this over here. Well, here's some bone, or some blood, I mean. So if I look at this blood, so there's the cell, right? And then all of this stuff is outside of the cell. So anything that is outside of the cell, if you think about ET, right? Extraterrestrial. So if it's extracellular matrix, right? So extra meaning outside the cell, and it's just a fluid. It's just a matrix. That's what makes up a lot of connective tissues. That ECM. Some connective tissues have more, right? So adipose tissue doesn't have as much ECM as maybe bone does. Your bone is almost all extracellular matrix. There's some small cells in there that would secrete the extracellular matrix, but it's pretty much all ECM, right? Let's see. The way to think about that extracellular matrix is it's kind of made up of almost like if you think about pouring concrete, right? Oftentimes when you pour concrete, you want to have like rebar in it, and that rebar helps it bend and move a little bit without the concrete just breaking. Same thing in your bones or in your connective tissues. You'll have a kind of a gel-like substance in there, but then you also have fibers extending through it, and all of that allows for movement. Same in your bones. Your bones have a lot of calcium in them, but they're not really, really rigid. They do bend, and in fact, they bend every time you move. So when you get up and walk around, your bones are bending a little bit. If they didn't, then they would crack, right? And so that extracellular matrix provides for all of that movement, right? Then we move to muscle tissue. Really kind of three major types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Some people in the forums have been asking me how to study. Tissues is a great, using note cards would be a great way to study tissues. So maybe write skeletal on one side and then put, examples of skeletal muscle on the back. Typically when I say muscle tissue, what you would be thinking about would be skeletal muscle, right? It's the muscle, right, that connects to your bones and allows for movement. They typically look, let me see if I've got a good, they typically look kind of like long cylinders. These are not the greatest examples. Let me see if I can bring one up here. Trying to type across things, so I'm sure that looks absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, so here's a good example. So notice how this tissue looks very cylindrical-like, and you've got these striations in it. Those striations, that's not an artifact of an image, right? Those striations are important, and we'll talk about those striations later when we talk about the muscular system itself, right? So very long cylindrical type cells with multiple nuclei, that's skeletal muscle tissue, right? Also under voluntary control. So you kind of have to think about contracting those. If you compare that to cardiac, right? So if I change this to cardiac muscle tissue, what you'll notice about cardiac muscle tissue is you kind of lose that cylindrical appearance. Here's maybe a good example, right? And so they're branched. Cardiac muscle is branched, and it has these special regions in it called intercalated discs. It's a special way, there's the micrograph of them. It's a special way for those cells to join together to allow the heart to kind of beat in unison. And then if you think about our cardiac muscle tissues, are they voluntary or involuntary? Right? They're involuntary, right? Thankfully for us, we don't have to think about our heart beating, right? And then we move on to smooth muscle tissue. So smooth muscle tissue is kind of spindle-shaped. If you've ever worked on a car, maybe you know what a spindle is, or if you've ever, here's a good example. This is a cartoon image, but Or if you've ever worked maybe in fabrics in a mill or something, you know what a spindle looks like. But spindles are usually tapered on one or both ends, right? And so that's smooth muscle tissue. It's under involuntary control, and it tends to line hollow organs, right? So maybe your digestive system, or maybe your cardiovascular system, right, with your veins and arteries, right? That's where you'll typically find smooth muscle tissue. You also don't find the striations in smooth muscle tissue. So think about, I didn't point it out in the cardiac, but both in skeletal and cardiac, you're going to see those striations exist. You don't see that in smooth, right? Because the way they contract, it's a little bit different, right? So those are the major types of muscle tissues. And then we go on to the nervous system. Nervous system, you're really going to have kind of two major types of tissue. You're going to have the neuron. So when I say nervous tissue, the thing that most people think of is this thing, right? And that's a neuron. And then you're going to have neuroglia. Neuroglia are any and all of the nervous system tissues that essentially support neurons or support the nervous system. Neuroglia meaning nerve glue, right? So it kind of holds everything into place or makes things function as they should or protects them, right? That's neuroglial cells. All sorts, right? And you can have. We'll talk more about the actual structure of a neuron later when we talk about the nervous system. But they typically have this area that kind of looks like this kind of star-shaped pattern, right? These are called dendrites. This is which way the signal would come in. This would be the cell body. This is the axon, and these are the axon terminals, right? So when you're sending signals down neurons, they start here and go in this direction, always, right? They're one directional. And so what you would have down here at the end is either another axon, or maybe you would have a muscle cell, or you might would have maybe a gland, right? And you would interact with that muscle cell or that gland to cause it to do whatever it is that it's going to do, right? So that's kind of the basics of. I don't want to get too much in the weeds there because we've got a whole chapter. That's part of the problem with some of these is we've got whole chapters that cover most of this stuff, and so just kind of want to stay somewhat topical here for you, especially in this kind of overview. Right? And then if we look at repair, all of the repair responses in your body are going to go through an inflammatory process. It's not a bad thing, right? Most people think of inflammation as bad. Inflammation is part of what happens, right? You need it. Inflammation causes the reason you feel heat, you got a larger blood supply there, right? The reason you get swelling is because you've got more fluid there, right? That's all part of the inflammatory response. Now, the inflammatory response can get out of hand, at which point it needs to be treated, but the inflammatory response is not bad. You see it with a fever, right? So most people, if they get a fever of 100, they want to take something to knock that fever out. Not necessarily anything wrong with that, but also not required, right? If your fever gets too high, 103, 104, then certainly you want to back that down a little bit. But the inflammatory response is something that happens and usually needs to happen for healing to occur to a point, right? You can get necrotic tissue, so that's tissue death, and you can get what's called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. So some cells at a certain age are kind of designed to die. Skin cells are an example of that, right? The way they elevate through multiple layers, they're kind of designed to die. And in fact, all of the skin cells on the surface of your skin are dead cells. That's one of the ways that they function. Right? Some processes or things that are involved in the inflammatory response. One, vasodilation. So again, that's what causes the heat, right? So when your veins or arteries get larger, there's a larger blood supply there, and also causes a release of more fluid. In some of your white blood cells, you get something called histamines. It's interesting that the other day, I am on social media quite a bit, usually to find things that are of interest and pertain to some of this. But anyway, the other day on TikTok, of all things, I saw someone saying that they were allergic to something that they consumed because of the histamines in that thing. That's not the way it works, right? You're not allergic to something because of its histamines. The allergic response that you get is because of your histamines, right? You release, from your white blood cells, you release histamines that cause a lot of this inflammatory response. For instance, the vasodilation. Why is it your nose starts to run when you maybe in the spring when all the pollen is around, right? It's because of the histamines in your white blood cells that are released that cause vasodilation and more fluid secretion, which causes your nose to run and sneeze and all that stuff. Or maybe your tissues to swell, right, in your sinuses. That's why you take an antihistamine to counteract the histamines that are in your own body, right? So it's not something you're consuming. You're not consuming the histamines. They're already there, and you're releasing those to kind of trigger that inflammatory response, which is, again, not always a bad thing, right? You need some of that to happen. You have a whole process involved in wound healing. We'll talk later in the semester when we talk about blood. We'll talk about how blood clots exactly. But essentially, you've got that inflammatory response. You get granulation of tissues, and then you get scar tissue to form. And then depending on how deep and how large the wound is, kind of governs how much scar tissue that you'll get. Some scar tissue remains for life. Some of it gets reabsorbed and looks relatively normal through time. And I'm sure you've seen all that or experienced that, right, as far as scar tissue goes. And then aging or atrophy. One of the things we're still kind of exploring in science, and not just in humans, but in all organisms, is what is aging and what causes it exactly. For instance, there is some idea that, let me go here and see if I can add another, let me add a new slide here. So when we talked about DNA in the previous chapter, it was mentioned a little bit about replication. One of the things that happens in DNA replication, so if you think about a chromosome, right? So chromosomes look like this. Well, at the ends of your chromosomes are these regions called telomeres. Right? And you have an enzyme. Well, I guess I should tell you what happens. What happens is when this piece of DNA or when this chromosome is replicated, right? So you go from this chromosome and then you end up with another one because of replication. What happens is every time that chromosome is replicated, those telomeres get a little bit shorter and a little bit shorter and a little bit shorter. And as that happens, you typically have an enzyme in there called telomerase that kind of tries to go back and add a little bit more of the telomeres. One of the things we've seen in people, so these folks that reach 100, 110 years old, it looks as if their telomeres are a little longer than the average. And so that might have something to do with aging. So as telomeres start to shorten, maybe as they get too short, right, you start to lose DNA that's important, and maybe that's part of what causes the aging process. And cells to atrophy, right, or tissues to atrophy, muscles to atrophy, right? That might be part of it. Anyway, it's interesting research. There's a lot of work going on in that now to try to figure out how it is that we can reverse or maybe even slow that process more and more, right? But as we age, we know we are more susceptible to certain things. So here we talk about type 2 diabetes, more respiratory illnesses, skin starts to get thinner. Again, you're familiar with all of this stuff. But exactly the causes for some of this, not fully known, at least not as much as we would like to, right? And so that's a pretty quick overview. Tissues chapter, probably not as tough as something like the cells chapter, but still, it's a chapter that takes some time. It's a chapter that's probably really good for using note cards on. I mean, you saw also what I did here. Just a quick Google search for some things will show you all sorts of pictures and or videos There's on YouTube. There's all sorts of. There's a good slide, for example. On YouTube, especially for medical students, there's a huge list of videos that you could search in order to find out some more information there, other than the ones that I've provided. One study technique that I would use is try to get this information in as much or as many different ways as possible. Obviously, I try to give you an overview here of things to look at in the chapter. I give you Wendy's videos. There's crash course videos out there by Hank Green. Khan Academy is another great place to go for videos. I would suggest maybe drawing things out. That would help certainly for tissues. But the more ways, the more angles that you come at these subjects or this material, the better. Right? So if you just sit down and you read the book, that's certainly one way to get the information in. But if you're actively doing something, right? So if you're actively writing some of this stuff out, or if you're creating note cards, or if you're creating your own PowerPoint slides, that's all great ways to kind of come at the material, at least in your brain, in a different way, right? Because if you're making the PowerPoint, right, there's an activity tied to it that helps you remember things. And so not just for this chapter, but for all chapters, try to do that. All right, and as always, if you have any questions, please let me know.